Welcome back to another episode of Explain Yourself. I'm still at ComSciCon, the Communicating Science Conference here in Boston, and I'm here with a Cylita guy from the University of Toronto. So we're going to talk about her research, and I've been nerding out about this research a lot. It's about one of my favorite study organisms, not one that I study, but you'll see why. So Cylita, do you want to start us off with your elevator pitch for what your research is?
Yeah, I study bats and their viruses, and I'm really interested in why bats are good at carrying viruses that they can sometimes share with humans, so things like rabies and Sars. So what makes it likely that they'll share them with us as humans, but also trying to help us understand why they don't get sick from them, whereas we as humans do.
Okay, wow, so there's a lot to unpack in there because we've got animals and we've got diseases and we've got transmission between different hosts. So let's talk bats first, because a lot of people are like, ooh, bats, there are lots of things
so awesome.
Yeah, they're awesome, but also a lot of people might not necessarily have, a great sort of perspective on bats. So can you tell us a little bit more about the bats you're studying and how they share natural spaces or not so natural spaces with humans?
Yes. So first off, if you don't love bats, you should love bats, because they're amazing animals. But so I guess I'll give you the ecosystem services argument. Bats are really important elements of our ecosystems, and so a lot of people don't realize they do things like pollinate agave. Agave is used to make tequila, right? They pollinate other tropical fruits that we enjoy. Bats here in North America are basically free pest control for our farmers. They take care of a lot of the insects that damage crops in certain areas, and so they are economically valuable to us as humans.
And they eat mosquitoes, and I hate mosquitoes. That's one of the only insects I hate. So yeah.
Fair enough. And so bats are really valuable. And so I initially started in a conservation background, so I recognize the value of my study system, and I think that everyone should appreciate it too. They're also they're cool. Like, they're the only mammals that can fly. Right? And there's 1,300 different species of bats. They count for 25% of all mammal diversity. I'm kind of taking this question in another tangent.
That's fine. I didn't realize, I love bats, but I had no idea that they were such a large percentage of all mammals. That's
so if we lined up every different mammal species, every fourth species would be a different type of bat. That's how many bats there are in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, really mind-blowing. And so one of the things that we don't really understand is we've known for a long time that some species of bats love to live in people's attics, in their barns, in their houses. We know that they live in cities, but we don't really understand how the cities and living alongside people changes their behavior. And so the big field project that I did in my PhD was trying to characterize that. So understanding, okay, when bats live in cities, do they eat in the same places? Do they eat in different places? Do they live in the same places? Do they form the same social groups? Like, is it babies living with moms and grandmoms? Or do they maybe have smaller social groups or bigger social groups? And so some of my work was trying to understand that. One of the really interesting things that we found is that they don't use green spaces like we thought that they did, which is not what we expected. We thought, big urban park that we're working in, we're going to catch lots of female bats, and we caught a lot of boy bats, which would suggest that the habitat is not as good as we might think. Now, again, one urban park, bit of an isolated sample, but some of the stuff we're currently doing a little bit of modeling to kind of parse that out, because there are some areas of the park where we get lots of ladies, not a lot of dudes, and so trying to figure out what is special about those areas of the parks, and then maybe scaling up to look at other urban parks in our area and do some extended sampling.
Okay. So what does make for a good bat habitat?
If I had to theorize, it wasn't what we thought. Big old trees with big old tree holes for females to form maternity colonies in to raise their babies. Large bodies of water that can support insect blooms, because that's what they'll be feeding on. Those are really the big things. It's interesting. I want to say less light pollution, but we know that bats are really great at feeding under street lamps, because that attracts a lot of insects as well. And so the park that we were working in had a giant, massive pond in it and these big old trees. And so we thought it would be good habitat for females, but there's more going on. I'm not sure what that is yet, because we're still analyzing that data.
Interesting. Okay. So that's fun when science doesn't turn out the way you expect it, because then you get to ask more questions.
Yes, and you also get to do this thing called wild speculation. And I love speculating wildly, although my supervisors maybe wish that I didn't do that.
But it's yet another good demonstration that if you are a curious person, you make a good scientist. So
Absolutely.
don't let anybody ever tell you that your curiosity is not useful, right? Okay, so bats, and then let's talk a little bit more about the diseases. So you mentioned SARS and rabies. And we were having a great conversation about rabies last night. So yeah, why do we care about those diseases interacting with people?
So those diseases are part of a subset of diseases called zoonotic diseases, or these species-jumping pathogens that leap from animal species into humans. And so we care about them because we can't really predict these jumps well at this point in time, and we don't know. So bats aren't the only species that carry these. Birds carry flu, but rabies is a big one. It's carried by a lot of mammals. Ebola is a zoonotic pathogen. We don't know who that reservoir species is. People think it's bats. It's not. The evidence doesn't all line up to support that.
Right, yeah.
And so we care about these things because they've led to some of the biggest, like we have flu pandemics on a regular basis, and these things, tax the people that they affect. I mean, nobody wants to get Ebola. Nobody wants to get really bad influenza. When I say bad influenza, I'm talking like Spanish flu killed a large percentage of the global population bad. But they also tax our global economies. Like a moderate flu outbreak is estimated to cost something like $13.5 billion US. And so understanding the species that carry these pathogens and trying to figure out how we can prevent these spillover events from happening is really relevant to human public health. But for me, as someone, again, coming from a conservation background, it's also really important for managing these species in the wild and understanding how, as humans, when we change the landscape, we drive spillover events sometimes. So how can we better manage our landscapes that is good for species, but also good for us by preventing these spillover events?
Right, which is why you're studying in an urban area, I guess, because that it increases the likelihood of the animals and the humans coming in contact with one another, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you said that for the diseases you're looking at, the bats can't get them. So if they can't get them, how do the humans get the diseases from the bats?
So what I should say is they can't acquire them. They can carry these viral infections, but they clear the infection. So for example, if you or I get the cold, we get a little bit sick, but we don't die from the common cold, right? We'll clear that rhinovirus, we're good to go. So with bats, it's kind of the same thing. So for example, if we look at a colony like vampire bats, and I say vampire bats because rabies circulates a lot in vampire bat colonies because of they're feeding on the blood of other mammals.
Right.
And they also do this really weird behavior where they will throw up blood for another individual who hasn't eaten in the night. And so there's a great way for rabies to spread. And so let's say if 10% of our bat colony is infected, of that 10%, only 1% will develop a lethal infection. So what's really interesting is rabies is probably the most virulent pathogen, one of the most virulent pathogens we know about. If you or I get it and we aren't treated, we'll die. And that is the case for a lot of mammals. With bats, sometimes they get it and they do die, but a lot of times they're just kind of like, oh, hey, it's kind of like common cold, cool, clear the infection. And that's what we don't understand. We think that there is something fundamentally unique about their immune systems and the way that they deal with. Let me back up here for a second. It probably has to do with the fact that they can fly. Flying is really metabolically expensive. They've probably evolved mechanisms to deal with the metabolic stresses of flying. It's like flying, you can think of being like sprinting full tilt everywhere. The human body would give out if we were to do that, but bats fly on a regular basis. And on top of that, they live a really long time for their size. And so these things would suggest that they have more efficient mechanisms in place to perhaps deal with oxidative damage, and that's helping them deal with viruses better. Or there's something special about their immune system. Either something is missing that's preventing this pronounced response to a virus. So we don't see what we say is the same immunopathy or the same damage that the immune system is causing to the individual. Or it could be that these mechanisms are helping them clean the virus out of their system so they keep it at low levels. Not sure. Lots of ideas out there.
So there's something special about the physiology of the bat that makes them able to most of the time deal with this virus, but because they dealt with it, just like you said, when we get the common cold, somebody else gets it from us, because we didn't die from it. So because the bat didn't die from the virus, it now passes it on.
It can transmit. And those periods of, like, you think about the common cold, before you start showing symptoms, you're sick and you are transmitting. And so sometimes those symptoms are a response of us, like, dealing with that infection. And so a bat can have an infection, it can share it and transmit it, but not actually be showing any adverse signs, and can then subsequently clear that infection and be okay.
Okay, awesome. So I could talk to you about your research for like hours, right? Because bats are amazing, and so is disease pathology and all that cool stuff. But the other part of this series, of course, is talking about our experiences as grad students. So what made you decide to become a scientist in the first place, and then also specifically to go on to grad school?
It's funny, I would argue that I am still not a scientist, because I suffer this, like, massive mental block where I'm just like, I'm not a real scientist yet. Like, I'm still
studying, right?
I'm working on it. But I mean, like that is something that's been around since my undergrad. I spent a lot of time convincing myself in my undergrad that I was not cut out for research. And don't ask me why I thought these things. I have no idea where it comes from. But my first exposure to a research environment was actually my first year. I was in this specialized course where they took 25 undergraduates. They put us all in 2 classes together. And one of these classes was History and Philosophy of Science. And the other was the Rhetoric of Science. And this particular professor took us through different modes of presenting science. So deconstructing scientific papers, but also general science writing. We did radio talks. That was one of our big projects. And we also, our big culminating project was we had to write a grant proposal that could be submitted to a funding body of a project of our choice. And so everyone in the class is like, well, I'm gonna do, like, cancer, and I'm gonna, like, look at diabetes. And it was very human-centric research. And of course I was like, I'm not interested in any of this. And we're getting down to time is when our professor needed us to have a topic, and he's like, Cylita, like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know. And at the same time at work, because I work at the Science Museum in Toronto, we'd had this exhibit on whales. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking around this exhibit and I'm like, whales. And so I walked in and I'm like, sir, I'm gonna do whales. And he was like, okay. And so part of the other thing about this course is he pairs you up with mentors, and he's like, I've never had to find a mentor for someone who does whale stuff. And he tried his best, and he couldn't find me a mentor, but it doesn't matter. I wrote a grant looking at proposing to look at the effects of seismic surveying equipment on whale communication. And so that was my first exposure, but I was still like, no, I'm not a scientist. I'm not meant to do research. It's not for me. And then in my second year, I was like, well, maybe I'll do something, like, I'll just want to do something completely different. Science student had a heavy science course load. In my first year, I had taken classical Latin. I was like, I'll do a research project in, like, classics. And so I found a gentleman in medieval studies who wanted a second-year student. And I worked with him to come up with different ways to date these really old liturgical books used by monks from the 13th century.
Wow.
And so that was fun because, like, I didn't know anything about, like, medieval studies. But it was this great opportunity to think really critically with, like, a completely new lens about this problem that somebody else had. I really should have clued in then that, like, science maybe was for me, but I still didn't. And so I did this project, and we submitted it to a conference for me to present at. Unfortunately, they told me I was too young, that they loved my work, but that I was too young. Then they looked forward to hearing from me when I was in grad school, and I was like, joke's on you. I'm not going to grad school. And so then I'm going through, like, my third year, and I'm doing all of my, like, my science coursework, and everything's going fine. And I started taking conservation and macroecology courses and biodiversity courses. And I get to the end of my third year, and I realize that I'm not going to be able to graduate unless I either do a field course or an honors thesis project. And I'm like, can I swear? I'm sorry, can I swear?
Yes.
Right, I'm like, I don't want to pay a whole bunch of money to do a field course in the tropics. I also really don't want to hang out with some of these other students at KSR for 2 weeks because I had a job at the time, and it was really important to me that I...
Sorry, KSR is...
Our field research station affiliated with our university.
Sure, okay.
It's a great place, but I was not prepared to not work because I needed the money, right? And so I was like, I need to find someone who will take me to do an honors thesis project. Right. And so I'm, like, looking at everyone in the department. Of course, I'm doing this super late. Like, it is exam period. And so I had been taking this conservation course, and I'm like, okay, I like the professor. I'm doing well in the course, I'll just ask her, and I'll be like really like apologetic and be like, hey, like you need to please help me. And so I was like, I wrote the exam for the course, and my plan was to send her an email a few days later, because I'm like, she's not going to know who I am at the exam, and that's stressful. And so I went up and I handed my exam into her, thinking like, it's a big class, she doesn't know who I am, I'll email her about this later. And she looks at my name, and then she looks at me, and she's like, you are the best student I have ever taught. She's like, if there's anything that I can do to get you to do stuff with me, I would love to have that conversation with you.
Yes!
And I'm like, I'm shaking, and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, just say sensible words. And I wish that I could say that I was like super calm. And
sure,
like,
yeah.
Well, yes. Actually, now that you say that, no, I was like, actually, yes, and like I was kind of hoping I could do a research project with you, so like, because I need to graduate, and yeah. And I was like, right? And she's like, well, I already have taken on a 4th year student, but she's like, you could twist my arm, and like I've got some ideas, and I was like, I'm gonna graduate. And so I sat down with her and we chatted with some ideas, and she basically, it was a really interesting project, and then she's like, I need this product for the Brazilian government. They want a map detailing what habitat is good for monkeys and what habitat is not. We were working with a small neotropical primate, the golden-headed lion tamarin.
Those are so cute.
And she's like, I need this map built, so let's design a project around that. And that's exactly what we did for the year. And so it was, I ended up doing a master's level project. We published it shortly after I started my PhD. The map is now being used to inform conservation in Brazil, which is really exciting. But Becky, a combination of Becky, or Dr. Rayboy, I guess I should say, and my very first professor, Dr. Baines, who taught me in my first year, they are the reason that I am in grad school now. Becky was like, we were sitting in the lab working one day, and she's like, what are you doing next year? And in my head, I'm like, I don't know what I'm eating for breakfast. I don't know what I'm doing next year. And she's like, I think you should think about a master's. And she's like, more importantly, the deadline for the master's graduate scholarship is due today. So she's like, drop everything you're doing and do it right now. And so I did. And I won with very little research experience, which to this day surprises me. I won one of our national level master's scholarships. And I started applying for grad school, and I was like, okay, well, like I'm still clearly not a scientist. Clearly, right?
Sure, yeah.
So I'm like, I'll do a little master's, and then I'll go off and I'll do something else that non-scientists do. I don't understand what goes through my head sometimes, and so I started applying for master's programs, and I thought about who I wanted to work with, and I'm applying, and I started interviewing, and had this one experience, and Becky's like, she's like, yeah, like this is gonna be great, like she's like, I think these people will be good for you to work with. And so I all excited for my first interview with a gentleman who works in fisheries science, and I spent all this time like reading up on what he did, and I came up with 4 possible lines. And so we sat down, we're having this conversation, and I'm like, I've prepped so much for this interview. The amount of reading that I did, I don't even want to think about. And we go through all these ideas, and he's like, yep, these are all great projects. And then he leans back in his chair, and he kind of like clasps his hands. He's like, but I'll be honest, like, he's like, I'm not going to take you for a master's. And I'm like, like in those moments where you can't process anything and you just want to cry, like that was that moment. And I'm sitting there rocking back and forth. And I'm like, I'm like I didn't know what to say. I think he was going for the dramatic effect though, because then he turns and he's like, but I'll take you for a PhD. And so of course I'm like I'll think about it, and I laughed, and I'm like, what the fuck is he thinking? Like, why does he want me as a PhD student? And then I got a couple other emails offering me PhD positions. And, I chatted with Becky about it, and she's like, yeah, like you don't need to do a master's, just do a PhD. And so I accidentally ended up in grad school.
That happens more often than most people think.
This was not planned. And so my path to science, it should have been very obvious to me. Like, I've always been curious about the natural world. I've always wanted to know how things work. I'm very good at problem solving. I'm good at like self-motivating and helping myself work through problems. These are all skills that make good scientists. But I think that initially, because I did not see a lot of people like me participating in the type of research that I wanted to do, I could not see myself taking up space in that particular location. So.
And when you say people like you, again, you guys have heard this before, but if you're new to the series, Explain Yourself is all about talking about the fact that anybody can and should become a scientist if they want to. So when you say people like you...
people like me, I mean, I fit, I think, into a lot of different categories. Mm-hmm. I mean, visually, I'm a woman. I'm also a heteronormative woman. I am mixed race. My father is black. My mother is white. I come from a family where I'm the first in my family to pursue a graduate degree. So my mom went to university, but she'll tell you she didn't really go to university because she did at the time what was like secretarial administrative services, which is not business. It kind of is. And my mom is an incredibly accomplished woman today, but she started off as a secretary, right? Mm-hmm. And so first in my family to pursue a graduate degree and a science degree. We also come from like a middle income, like we're not exorbitantly rich.
Right.
And so I think that, so when I say a person like me, there are lots of different people who can identify with different aspects of that, and that was not the kind of people who I was seeing participate in research in my department. I do think that is shifting slowly, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, absolutely, which is unfortunate, but it is nice to meet. I mean, yeah, parts of your story have sounded similar to me too, which is nice that, yeah, we are all humans, and what we want to do for our career doesn't have to be defined by where we started, which is nice. So being part of those groups that you mentioned, are there experiences that you would want your younger self to be like prepared for that you've had, or like things that you would want to tell your younger self so that she would know a little bit more about what she was getting herself into?
So thinking about it in that perspective, unfortunately, and I do think that this is unfortunate, I'm going to say no.
No?
Because I think my younger self experienced a lot of things. So I grew up in a neighborhood where I was not part of, I was a minority in that neighborhood. And so like my brothers and I got picked on a lot when we were in school because we didn't identify. And the dominant group in our neighborhood, interestingly enough, was not white. We grew up in a primarily Filipino neighborhood.
Interesting.
And so and I think that really goes to show we often talk a lot about racism being unidirectional. It's not. It can interact in any sort of way that a person interacts with another person. And so growing up, I experienced those sorts of things, and I didn't necessarily learn to associate them with the color of my skin, but I did learn to associate them with the fact that something about me was different, and that's okay. I mean, lots of kids go through that for a lot of other reasons too. But also, I mean, at my job at the Science Center, one of the things that we often find is that sometimes visitors have this tendency to challenge our female staff on facts that we are presenting and that we know to be true. And so I've had a lot of experiences where I've had parents who just do not want to hear what I have to say, and that is frustrating. But I'm lucky in that I have some great male advocates on our staff, where I think one of my favorite experiences, I had this parent who he had no interest in clearly hearing what I had to say. He goes to a male coworker to solicit essentially someone to validate his point of view, and he's politely listening, and my male coworker stops him and is like, I don't actually know why you're asking me, because that woman over there has advanced degrees in this topic, so she knows what she's talking about. He, of course, did not come back to ask me. He kind of scurried away. But, and unfortunately, sometimes those things do persist in academia. I definitely do see women are sometimes either cut off or challenged in seminars, and I'm sure this is something you probably experienced as well.
At least seen, yeah.
And I've experienced very subtle, I'm in Toronto. It's one of the most diverse cities we report to be one of the most diverse cities in North America. And I've been confused for the only other half black student in the department. And we beyond like the color of our skin, like we're not the same person.
No.
And I don't think that behavior is excusable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. To bring it back to something happier, we are at ComSciCon, so let's talk a little bit about your science communication pursuits. Where can people find you outside of the papers you publish?
So first place you'll find me is at the Ontario Science Centre. We're not really a museum. We say we're a center. We're a science and technology museum in Toronto. We are the biggest in Ontario, and so I work there as delivering public demonstrations, and that could mean I'm doing workshops with toddlers, I could be doing planetarium shows, I could be leading nature walks. I also have worked with a nature center where I did my field work to create a citizen science project getting kids collecting data about bats using little handheld acoustic detectors. And I also do various events around the city. So I get booked in to lead bat walks for folks. I get booked in to do bar talks about parasites. I've done a story collider story that is on their podcast, so you should check that out.
Awesome. I'll link it down there. You can find it down there.
I've done more storytelling about kind of my experiences in science, and so I'm kind of everywhere and anywhere where I see there's a cool opportunity. In September I'll be doing Soapbox Science, which I don't know if you're familiar with.
I've heard of it, yeah, but can you...
I'm basically going to stand on a soapbox, like old school Hyde Park, like from London style, and yell at people. Not yell at them, but like try to draw them in and just talk about my science in a busy public spot in Toronto. No props, no slides, no nothing.
That's super fun.
Yeah, it should be exciting.
So you can find Cylita in lots of places doing SciComm about bats, and I love citizen science, so that was super exciting for me to hear about. So are there any sort of like final thoughts that you want people to know about your research or your experiences in grad school, and also what are you doing next?
What am I doing next? So no other final thoughts. If you're on the fence about grad school, you will hear lots of people share experiences that seem negative, but I think I'd like to emphasize that regardless of any of my negative experiences, I would not change going to grad school. And I think that it's really important that people who have not traditionally participated in whatever discipline or area of research you're doing continue to do so, because that contributes to opening up these spaces further. What am I going to do next? Again, don't know what I want to eat for breakfast. Really no idea what's going to come after this. I am actually thinking that a role in data science might be appropriate because I like solving problems and I like data. But I also do have a passion for making information accessible, and so I know that I will continue to do science outreach and communication in some capacity. Just what form that takes on, I don't know yet.
Awesome. Well, I was so excited to get the chance to talk to you, so thank you for sharing all of your stories with us. It's been a ton of fun, and we wish you the best of luck figuring out what to eat for breakfast and what to do with the rest of your life as well. And we know where to find you if we want to hear more about bats and diseases and all kinds of things, which is awesome. So if you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.